Session on the Senate floor. But here's a key takeaway. The bill's passage can now allow Republicans to overhaul the tax code without any support from Democrats. Republican Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina serves on the Finance Committee, and that was quite an impressive thing for the Republicans to do last night because, there haven't been that many victories so far this year. But as far as this goes, I think that it's extremely significant. How about you?
Absolutely. I talk about the opportunity to deliver what I'm calling the middle-class miracle, tax relief for folks in the middle class. The budget was the necessary precursor, the prerequisite for that conversation to start in earnest. So we are excited to be on this side of a 51-49 vote, and it obviously shows that Republicans can stick together when the American people are our focus.
So just to explain to people, the procedure is that if you can pass the budget, then within that fiscal year, you can then try to do tax reform under what's called reconciliation. So that's why you only need 51. Is that right?
Exactly. So the reconciliation vehicle allows us to move legislative priorities that are financial in nature to a 51 vote as opposed to the normal 60 vote threshold in the Senate.
Well, of course, Senator Chuck Schumer, the minority leader, was none too pleased. Let's listen to him and get your take on it.
Sounds good.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's a quote. I thought I had sound. Well, I won't try to imitate his voice, but that would have been amazing. This nasty back and forth between budget greenlights cuts to Medicare and Medicaid in order to give a tax break to big corporations and the wealthiest Americans. It shifts the burden from the wealthy and puts it squarely on the back of the middle class and blows a hole in the deficit to boot. I think it will go down in history as one of the worst budgets Congress ever passed. So to me, it sounds like they could have cut and paste that for any Republican budget. But do they have a point on the deficit?
I don't think so. Here's the fact. If you believe that high taxes puts us in a poor competitive position, that lower taxes puts us in a better competitive position, if we're in a better competitive position, we're going to grow our economy. That growth of our economy that we need to make up for any short-term deficits is about 0.4%. So we can make up 0.4% with better taxes and better regulations. You'll find that our economy will grow faster than usual. Our usual is 1.9%. All that combined together, simply said, we'll have more tax revenue, we'll have more jobs, a healthier economy, and everybody gets to keep more of their paycheck. That is a false statement by Chuck Schumer.
So this debate is going to really come down to, is this really mostly helping the wealthy? And how can you guarantee that people that live in your home state of South Carolina will actually have more money in their pocket? Because I imagine that's all they ask you is, how much more money am I going to have in my paycheck every week?
My funny hashtag is keep your money. And one of the reasons why that is my hashtag is because when I go to the barbershop, I know you're wondering why I go to the barbershop, but when I go to the barbershop, everything I hear is about... It really is. It's a great place to have a chat. They all want to know, how much of my money do I get to keep? And here's the answer. The average person in this country will see about $4,000 annually stay in their paychecks. Said differently, $350 a month on average, the average person in our country gets to hold on to, because our focus is hardworking, everyday Americans, not the rich. That is a good start for us. And then the second tier is those folks who are living at the federal poverty level. By doubling the standard deduction, we get to say to those folks, they get to have more of their money to take care of their family, their kids, and their requirements.
But, okay, so there could be a hitch, maybe not, but right now, as we speak, the House Freedom Caucus and the chair of that, Congressman Mark Meadows from North Carolina, they're meeting right now. These are the House guys, and they have to decide whether they can accept the Senate budget. If they can't, there's going to be more of a back and forth. But the timing of this is important because the president wants this on his desk by December 1st. Secretary Mnuchin promised it. Do you think that the House will accept what you guys put together on the Senate side?
I am very encouraged. The word coming out of the House as late as last night when we were still on the floor was that the budget as we constructed it probably is acceptable for the Freedom Caucus. If that's the case, that saves us about 2 weeks of negotiations with the House. Said differently, it makes the timeline of Thanksgiving realistic. Without that, we certainly are pushing up against a deadline of the end of the year.
You can imagine that Senator Schumer is probably hoping that this is another Lucy with the football situation, but you sound confident, and we appreciate you being here today. Thanks, Senator Scott.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dana.
Thank you. A Fox News alert, Defense Secretary James Mattis, he's set to meet with Senator John McCain as lawmakers demand answers on the terrorist ambush in the African nation of Niger. That took the lives of 4 American service members. 2 other U.S. soldiers were wounded. Lucas Tomlinson is live at the Pentagon. Lucas, I understand the Pentagon and the FBI are now both involved in the investigation.
Good afternoon, Dana. That's correct. A U.S. military general officer is now on the ground in Niger to lead the investigation. But the FBI is also en route, too, bringing their world-class law enforcement techniques to help piece together the events and the timeline that led to this horrific attack. Now, a short time ago here at the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Jim Mattis met his French counterpart to thank her for her help in rescuing 2 American soldiers who were wounded during the battle. The French sent 2 helicopters. The 12-man U.S. Special Operations team was ambushed at 11 a.m. local time on October 4th. 30 minutes later, French Mirage fighter jets flew overhead. Now, officials tell Fox the jets were armed but did not drop any bombs on the militants because the jets couldn't tell the difference between friend or foe on the ground. Now, the Green Berets meeting with tribal elders near the border with Mali went longer than expected, which could have tipped off the militants to the attack. And I was upstairs for the meeting with Defense Secretary Mattis's French counterpart. I asked the secretary if he supported the FBI being a part of the investigation. He refused to answer. Dana?
And why is Secretary Mattis going to Capitol Hill?
Well, just yesterday, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator John McCain, expressed skepticism over the information he was receiving from the Pentagon. In fact, he threatened to issue a subpoena to top officials. Now, yesterday, a top U.S. military general responded to the critics.
Now, the fact of the matter is, it's a battlefield. We just had a significant engagement. It's a tough country. It's out in the middle of nowhere. So it's not perhaps as clear as it might appear in the bright lights of this briefing room.
Now, Niger is twice the size of Texas in area, and no drone was overhead during the attack. Dana?
All right, Lucas, thank you so much. Joining me now for more on this is Michael Waltz. He's a former Green Beret commander and Fox News contributor, and a valuable one at that, especially with this because you actually had been as a Green Beret in Africa.
I served in Niger in 2014 doing this exact same counterterrorism mission.
And you were nodding your head when Lucas was explaining that it's not unusual to have this circumstance.
Well, so I think there's a couple of things, right? There's one, what are we doing in Niger? A lot of people are asking that mission, and we actually have Green Berets embedded with local militaries all over Africa. If you look at Niger in particular, you have Boko Haram to the south, you've got Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, you have ISIS pouring out of Libya. We have a pure counterterrorism mission, but we do it not necessarily pulling triggers by, with, and through the local forces. I think the other thing that people are asking, and as Lucas just raised, is, well, why didn't they have the air support and the drones and all of those things we've become accustomed to? And I think we've become a little bit over-accustomed from the wars in Iraq and the wars in Afghanistan, where we have a high density of all those types of support assets. We can't have that all over the world, and we certainly can't have it in a place as big and as spread out as Africa.
Tell me about how much are we asking of our special forces?
Well, right now, today, we are in 60 to 80 countries worldwide every day doing these types of missions. You know, the long war against Islamic extremism is going to be done through local forces, and that's what Green Berets specialize in. Okay, well, then, given that, do we need, when you said that we don't necessarily have, I don't know if it's rules of engagement or the ability to fire if we need to. Well, we do. They can they can always fire in self-defense, and in this case, when they were ambushed, they absolutely defended themselves. What we don't necessarily have is a Predator drone over every single patrol in those 60 to 80 countries around the world. In this case, we relied on coalition aircraft. They were there within 30 minutes. But, you know, I just can't overstate how big and expansive Africa is. You know, if you take China and the United States and stack them end to end, that's the type of territory you're dealing with in North Africa.
Since you've been in the field and you've commanded Green Berets that are doing this kind of work, can you imagine a situation, a scenario where LaDavid Johnson could get separated from the others.
Sure. In the fog of war, with a complex ambush, I do think we need to look into what we missed on the intelligence side of things here. With intense fire going on, and as a commander on the ground, and I've had to make this decision, do you pull out the majority of your unit, or do you risk the unit getting annihilated in the kill zone trying to save everyone? In my case, I had to leave an Afghan soldier behind, but we went back and got him immediately when they were able to pull him out. But I guarantee you those Green Berets did everything they could to get him out. There should be no question there.
In the remaining time that we have, I do want to ask you about when you have to make calls to family members about individuals that you were with, that you were under your command, that didn't make it. Because we've been talking a lot about that this week. Just from your perspective of being somebody who has made those calls, how difficult is it?
I've made those calls and written those letters. You were with President Bush when he did the same thing, and every family reacts differently. Some are angry, some are thankful, some never wanted their loved one to go in the military in the first place. It is the most difficult thing you could ever be asked to do as a commander and as a commander-in-chief, and I don't think anyone can really criticize or judge how those interactions
and
go
certainly
down.
It's the most difficult call that you would ever receive as well if your loved ones was...
I can't even wrap my mind around it.
All right.
Sure.
All right, Michael Waltz, thank you for being here. We appreciate your expertise. The White House press briefing set to get underway any minute. We will take you there live when it begins. And Bill Clinton... As we wait for Press Secretary Sarah Sanders to begin the White House briefing, there is new information about Bill Clinton and the Russian nuclear bribery scandal. So newly found documents reveal the former president wanted to meet with a key director of the Russian firm behind the uranium deal as Clinton prepared to collect $500,000 from a bank connected to the Kremlin for a speech. Michael Meehan is president and CEO of Squared Communications and former chief of staff for Senator Maria Cantwell. And Alex Conant is a former communications director for Senator Marco Rubio and a partner of Firehouse Strategies. I don't know, Firehouse versus Squared. Here we go. We'll try. Okay, Alex, tell me what your thoughts are about this Bill Clinton story, because it started a couple of days ago, but it seems to be actually gaining momentum.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of strange things happening here. So at the core of this is the U.S. government approved a Russian business to buy an American uranium company. We worked in the White House. We dealt with these sorts of deals all the time. Most of them are totally fine. They might look bad.
Except for Dubai Ports, which I distinctly remember.
Exactly.
Was one of these. Is that one of these deals, right? It's the CFIUS process.
It's a very good example where ultimately it went through. It was okay, but politically it's just awkward. And that was one of these cases. What makes this even more awkward is while the Russian government was trying to get approval for it, they paid Bill Clinton $500,000 to give a speech. That doesn't smell right, and that is what's coming out now. That's why this is an issue right now. Why did they pay him that much money to give a speech? And was there something improper happening there?
Well, we don't know exactly why they would pay I guess we could assume, Michael, that this keeps coming up because the question is, were the Clintons selling access to either the State Department or in their minds, possibly the White House, during these years leading up to her running for president?
Yeah, the optics on this are horrible, right? It's 2010. His wife's in charge of the State Department, and he's over conducting business. Now, in the end, it could be legal. In the end, he went the proper channels and asked protocol. I mean, if the Trump family had followed the same protocol, Mr. Mueller might be on vacation now and not actively busy. But at least they followed protocol, and in the end, he didn't do it. But clearly, I think there are problems on the optics of this.
Yeah, and then also, you have another part of the thread, Alex, is that Bob Mueller was at the FBI at the time, and so was James Comey. And so then there's the question of, is there something there? And so I think everybody's going to have to answer some questions.
And Congress is starting to look into it. But I think it's important that we keep this what happened in 2010, separate from what's happening now with the Mueller investigation, the Russia trying to impact our 2016 elections. That is a big issue, one that we need to address moving forward, and keep it separate from whatever the Clintons were up to 8 years ago.
So let me ask you about that on the Russia trying to interfere in the elections. And there's legislation now that's being proposed by two Democrats that would basically try to put some regulation on the internet companies, Facebook, Google, Twitter, et cetera, to have basically disclosures, like where it says, I'm Dana Perino and I approve this message, and all of these internet ads. This is the first time that these Silicon Valley giants have really faced the prospect of big regulation. I'm not sure how I feel about it. What about you?
Well, I think 12 years ago Facebook didn't exist, and now it is where half of the world gets their information. And so I think with the burden of success comes the burden of responsibility. I don't think it's terribly horrible to say this ad is paid by Michael Meehan, and I'm allowed to use my free speech to say so. It just has to accurately say that I'm the one that's saying it. And I think there's some fairness involved in that. We require people who run for federal office to say how much money to the dollar that they spend when they buy a TV ad. Why shouldn't we require some outside agency to say whatever they want to say, but say this is who I am and this is how much I paid for?
But when it came to some of these ads that they are saying that the Russians put forward, it wasn't even specifically about Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, or they wouldn't even mention it at all. But they seem to have actually, you guys are saved by Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who is now going to take the White House podium. So we'll go to the briefing.
Don't let Brian Karam show you up. I know that there is more spirit out there. As many of you saw last night, the Senate adopted a budget resolution. This is another important milestone for tax reform and sets the stage for us to pass major tax cuts that will deliver more jobs and higher wages for hardworking Americans all over the country. Many of you have seen today that the First Lady donated the gown she wore to the inaugural balls to the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. In her speech, she mentioned that leading up to Inauguration Day, everyone was so busy getting ready that the dress's designer ended up only having 2 weeks to work on the First Lady's design and create the dress. It obviously came together, and the First Lady is very excited to take part in the rich tradition of First Ladies contributing to and maintaining our great history. By the way, if you've not visited the Smithsonian's exhibit of First Lady dresses, you certainly should take time to do that. Lastly, today is a particularly special day for all of us here at the White House. There are a lot of people here who serve the president and our country behind the scenes. One of those people is Hope Hicks, our incredible communications director. Tomorrow is her birthday, and as you know, I love a good birthday. So I wanted to make sure to mention it here in the last briefing of the week. So happy birthday, Hope. If you get a minute, be sure to send her a note and wish her a happy birthday. Thanks for your selfless leadership and perhaps most importantly, your great sense of humor. And with that, happy Friday, and I'll take your questions. Jeff.
Sir, I'd like to open with a question about the Fed. The president finished his interviews this week and said in an interview with Fox Business that he would consider having Powell and Taylor come to the Fed together. Should we take that as a signal that the other candidates are not going to get the job?
We still don't have an announcement on that. As the president said, that's something that's certainly under consideration, but he hasn't ruled out a number of options, and he'll have an announcement on that soon in the coming days.
What else is he looking for as he makes his decision?
As you know, I'm not going to get ahead of a big announcement like that the president himself will make, but we'll keep you posted when we're ready to roll that out.
Sure.
Blake.
On that note, Janet Yellen, the president was extremely critical of her during the campaign, saying at one point she was too political, that she should be ashamed of herself, essentially said she was a political arm of President and Hillary Clinton. Now he said some rather nice things about her, most recently a couple times that he respects her. What has changed in his thinking as it relates to Janet Yellen over the last year, and can you shed some light on their relationship?
I think them having the opportunity to spend some time directly communicating with one another, certainly through this process. But beyond that, again, I'm not going to weigh any further into this process and where we are, other than the fact that the president will make an announcement on it soon.
Sir, when is the president himself going to weigh in on what happened to those 4 special ops soldiers in Niger?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I follow your question there.
Will the president address publicly, and if so, when? What exactly happened to these 4 special ops soldiers?
Yeah, as we said, as General Kelly specifically addressed several times yesterday, that the Department of Defense has initiated a review which occurs anytime there's an American that's killed in action. We're going through that process. The president, the Department of Defense, and frankly the entire country and government want to know exactly what happened. And the president and the nation are grateful for those 4 American heroes, and we won't rest until we get some answers, and that's part of this process, and that's what they'll do. And when the time is appropriate, we'll talk about the details of the investigation.
Sarah, the South Florida Sun Sentinel released a video of Congresswoman Wilson's speech in 2015. In the speech, it doesn't appear that she referenced funding for the FBI building in South Florida. Does General Kelly still stand by the statement that he made yesterday that he felt that she was grandstanding and that she was taking credit
Absolutely. General Kelly said he was stunned that Representative Wilson made comments at a building dedication honoring slain FBI agents about her own actions in Congress, including lobbying former President Obama on legislation. As General Kelly pointed out, if you're able to make a sacred act like honoring American heroes all about yourself, you're an empty barrel. If you don't understand that reference, I'll put it a little more simply, as we say in the South, all hat, no cattle.
Well, in fact, have you seen the speech?
I have.
And then you know that most of it was her effusively praising these FBI agents. And when she was talking about what she did in Congress, she was not talking about securing the $20 million. She was talking about naming the building for these FBI agents, who she then went on to effusively praise. And that was the bulk of the speech.
She also mentioned that, and she also had quite a few comments that day that weren't part of that speech and weren't part of that video that were also witnessed by many people that were there. What General Kelly referenced yesterday.
Tell us specifically, because
exactly what he said. There was a lot of grandstanding. He was stunned that she had taken that opportunity to make it about herself.
Can he come out here and talk to us about this at some point?
I think he's addressed that pretty thoroughly yesterday.
No, he was wrong yesterday in talking about getting the money. The money was
if you want to go after General Kelly, that's up to you. But I think that if you want to get into a debate with a four-star Marine general, I think that's something highly inappropriate. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. When President Trump spoke at the CIA building in January in front of the stars of 117 CIA agents who had fallen and been killed in the line of duty, he talked about a number of different things, including a lot about himself. He talked about the fake news attacking him. He talked about the MLK bus and the controversy over that. He talked about the crowd size.
That wasn't an event set to memorialize those individuals. That was a celebration talking about the transfer of power. It's two very different events. If you look at the president's comments at events like the 9/11 ceremony earlier this year, those were very somber. Those were focused specifically on those events. Those are not even apples to apples, so that's not a fair comparison. Jordan.
Thank you, Sarah. Putting the Congresswoman aside for a second, I want to focus on what the mother of Sergeant Johnson said. She said that she felt that the president disrespected her in his comments. Now, regardless of the president's intentions, is the president concerned that what he said might have come across as disrespectful, and does he plan to follow up with her and repair that relationship?
Certainly, if the spirit of which those comments were intended were misunderstood, that's very unfortunate. But as the president has said, as General Kelly said, who I think has a very deep understanding of what that individual would be going through, his comments were very sympathetic, very respectful, and that was the spirit in which the president intended them. If they were taken any other way, that's certainly an unfortunate thing. John.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. The 43rd president of the United States, President George W. Bush, made some comments in New York City yesterday, and I'd like you, if you could, just to address some comments that he made just concerning the issue of Russia, specifically Russian influence in the United States. He said the Russian government has made a project of turning Americans against each other, and he also said that Russian interference will not be successful. Foreign aggressions, including cyber attacks, disinformation, and financial influence, should never be downplayed or tolerated. Do you agree with those sentiments expressed by the former president?
Do we agree that Russian interference shouldn't be tolerated? Absolutely. And we've said that many times before, and certainly would argue that that has been repeated. I know I've said it at least a dozen times from this podium.
And I just want to follow up with a question I've asked you a few times, most recently in July. It relates to our relationship with Russia, and I've never gotten an answer for you on that. Does the President Trump, view Russia as an ally, a partner, or an adversary?
And as I've said before, I think a lot of that depends on Russia and what type of relationship they want to have and whether or not they want to be a good actor or a bad actor. And we're going to continue trying to work with them on certain things that are very important, particularly for national security, on things like Syria, on things like North Korea. We'd like to be able to work with them to confront some of those threats. And so some of that will be determined by the actions that Russia takes and how they want to be perceived. Matthew.
Thanks. I also have a question about that George W. Bush speech, but first, just to clarify, are you saying the White House is no longer saying that the Congresswoman talked about the funding? She just talked about legislation in general?
We're talking, I specifically said, and I'll repeat it again, that General Kelly said he was stunned that she made the comments about herself, and that was the point of what he said. That was what took place here yesterday, and we still stand by those comments.
Okay, and then on the George W. Bush speech, he said at one point, bigotry seems emboldened, our politics seem more vulnerable to conspiracy theories and outright fabrication. Does President Trump agree with this assessment? And if so, what does he see as his role in addressing that?
Does he agree with the assessment of what? I'm sorry.
That bigotry seems emboldened and our politics seem more vulnerable to conspiracy theories and outright fabrication. Those were former President Bush's words.
I think if anybody is pushing a lot of fabricated things right now, I think most of that would be coming from the news media, and we would certainly agree with that sentiment. David?
The President signed an executive
What about
order
the
today.
bigotry? I'm sorry, I've called on David.
The President signed an executive order today. Basically, and what it appears to do is it allows the Pentagon to recall retired officers into duty under the 9/11 authority that he has. What's the reason for this executive order?
I don't have anything further on that, and I'll have to get back to you, David. Sarah?
General Kelly was obviously very upset that this has now become a political conversation, the President's call with the widow, and I think more broadly the fallout of the soldiers that were killed in Niger. So why did he feel like it was appropriate to come out here to call a Congresswoman an empty barrel rather than calling her privately like he's done with other members of Congress who've been critical of the President? And why did President Trump feel the need to take that even further today and tweet about her?
I think that it's real simple. You guys are the ones talking a lot about that story, and he felt it was important to address you and all of America directly. This story has been given an enormous amount of coverage over the last 48 hours, and he thought it was important that people got a full and accurate picture of what took place, and that was a personal decision that he made, that he wanted to come out and frankly not just share with you, but like he said, share with all of America and make an appeal to America to go back to kind of honoring that sacred code of Gold Star families.
The question that the President was asked earlier today, I know there's an investigation.
And in terms of, hold on, just to finish on the rest of your question, why the President felt the need to respond, it's because it should have ended yesterday after General Kelly's comments. But it didn't. It continued. And it's still continuing today. It's still the bulk of the coverage on most every TV you turn on and most every newspaper that you open up today. And the President responded to those continued accusations and continued mischaracterizations of his comments.
One other question, the President was asked earlier today whether he authorized this mission in Niger. Can you give us any information about whether this was something he authorized or even something he was aware of before finding out that American soldiers were killed in it?
As I said, there's, as it's the process, anytime an American is killed in action, there is a full review that takes place, and before we start jumping to any conclusions, we want to make sure that that is completed fully, and then we'll have those details for you at that time.
Sarah, thanks. On Niger, a senior congressional aide who was briefed on the matter said that there is an indication that there was a massive intelligence failure. Is that the assessment of the White House?
Once again, as I just told Sarah, we're going to wait until that review is complete by the Department of Defense, and we'll answer those questions at that time.
One more question, Sarah.
Sorry,
Laura Trump said she saw a transcript of the phone call. Can you just answer that question, Sarah?
Did the President authorize explicitly the operation in Niger, or was that delegated down in the...
Again, I'm not going to get into any of the details at this point. You may be able to talk with those at the Department of Defense, and they can answer anything further. But where we are in the process until the review is complete, we're not going to weigh in any further. Kelly?
The Senate Foreign Relations Committee is going to take...
Sorry, I'm going to try to get to everybody. Kelly, go ahead.
Given all of the reaction to the content of the President's phone call, does President Trump intend to make phone calls to families of the fallen in the future should other Americans die while he is Commander-in-Chief?
I think we're hoping and praying that those phone calls don't have to take place, and so that's where we are right now.
The Los Angeles Times has reported, we've reported that the military operating in Niger have requested additional overwatch capacity and medical response assistance in the months leading up to this ambush on October 4th. Is the President satisfied that that Special Forces unit, when it went out there that day, had all the resources that it needed to operate there?
As I've said several times here today and will continue until that review is complete, I'm not going to get into the details until that is finalized. I think too often in cases like that, we have jumped to conclusions and tried to make determinations before all of the details are known. We want to make sure that that process is complete before we weigh in. John Gizzi.
Thank you, Sarah. And have to keep it to one question today?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Even you, John. I know it'll be tough.
I obey.
Wow, if only I had that kind of power over anybody else, including my kids, that would be great.
Reluctantly. Several London publications have said that the president's visit to London, when and if the details work out, will be a working visit with Prime Minister May and not an official state visit, which means he will not be received by the Queen at Buckingham Palace. What will be the nature of his visit to London and to Prime Minister May? A working visit or a state visit?
That still hasn't been determined. We're still going back and forth with our allies there, and once we have those travel details outlined and determined, we'll certainly let you know. But they've made the invitation for the president to come. We've accepted, and we're working out the logistics. We anticipate that it'll be sometime next year, but at this point, there's no other details beyond that.
Downing Street has made the invitation.
Thanks, Eric. State Department announced today that it's now up to 24 people who have been impacted by the sonic attacks in Havana. I wanted to ask, is the president satisfied with the investigation into what's happening, and has he reached out or considered reaching out to any of the victims?
I don't believe that he has reached out to any of the victims involved at this point. That's an ongoing investigation and something we can't weigh in on further at this time.
On the call to Sergeant Johnson, Laura Trump seemed to suggest in an interview this morning that there was a transcript of the call and that she read it. Is there a transcript, and has it been shared with members of the president's family?
There's not a transcript of the call. I believe she was responding to reports and things that she had read, but I haven't spoken directly with her. I'd refer you to the campaign that handles her press inquiries. But there's not a transcript. Fred?
Oh, thanks, sir. Senator John Cornyn confirmed today that he is blocking the nomination to OMB for Russ Lloyd to try to get more relief funds for Texas after Hurricane Harvey. Does that come as a surprise or disappointment to the White House that the number 2 Republican would be blocking a nominee?
The administration welcomes a conversation with all members of Congress about the next disaster relief request, which we expect to come in the coming weeks. While we work with Congress on that next request, we urge the Senate to keep doing their jobs by confirming qualified nominees to crucial positions inside our government. This administration has already faced unprecedented obstruction of its nominees, and further delays only hurt the American people. And we hope that they'll get on board and make that process move further along.
Sarah, given President Bush's comments yesterday that were asked about, in general, does the White House feel it's appropriate for past presidents to be critical of the sitting president? And when was the last time President Trump spoke to President Bush?
I'm not sure the last time they spoke, but our understanding is that those comments were not directed towards the president. And in fact, when these two individuals, both past presidents, have criticized the president, they've done so by name, and very rarely do it without being pretty direct, as both of them tend to be. So we'll take them at their word that these actions and comments weren't directed towards the president.
The United Nations, of course, is following very carefully the refugee situation along the Bangladesh-Myanmar border. And President Trump today met with the UN Secretary General. Did they speak about the Rohingya refugee situation? Was the president asked for any further help? What was the tenor of their conversation?
They had a very productive conversation. We'll have a readout coming with more details about that later this afternoon. And we'll be around the rest of today to answer questions. And with that, happy Friday. Hope you guys have a good weekend. Thanks.
All right, that was Sarah Sanders at the White House press briefing on a Friday where the press was somewhat losing airspeed and altitude there at the end of the very busy week. I'm back with Michael Meehan, former Chief of Staff for Maria Cantwell, and Alex Conant, former Communications Director for Senator Marco Rubio. I'm glad that you stayed because there's a couple of things I want to hit you with. One is that the White House has a big win on its plate right now. They basically saw the Republicans come together in the Senate last night to pass a budget that the House is likely to take on as well. So that gives them a clear run for tax reform. And yet most of the briefing was taken up talking about the story of the week, Alex, about the president's phone calls to a family of the fallen and the controversy that's surrounded.
Yeah, and it's just this is a problem of their own making. You're right. Last night, the Senate, around 9:30 p.m., passed their budget, the first step towards passing tax reform. Arguably the biggest legislative accomplishment of this president's presidency so far. And yet an hour later, at 10:53, President Trump was tweeting an attack at Representative Wilson, relitigating this fight that Chief of Staff Kelly should have ended yesterday. But the president was the one that started engaging on this. He didn't tweet about tax reform until this morning. And so, of course, it's being overshadowed because the president clearly wants to talk about Gold Star families rather than tax reform. That's a strategic mistake on his part.
But what about, Michael, I feel like there's no winner out of this controversy this week. Gold Star families deserve all of our respect and attention. I think commanders-in-chief have to make really tough decisions and phone calls that they would never want to have to make. I can't believe that we're 5 days into this week and we're still talking about it.
Yeah, it's just so painful that these four families, these Marines who gave their lives for their country, have to have this be the conversation that's happening and not remembering their lives and have this sort of be a political ping pong ball. Do you
think that Federico Wilson, the congresswoman who was there in the car and then reported it to the press and is now in this dispute with the White House, do you think she wants this to end, or does she think that it's working in her favor to be out there having a public fight with the White House about this?
Look, she showed respect for the family by being with the widow in the car when the call happened to have come by. I think that's her act of supporting the family. Everybody gets to express their feelings in the best way possible. There's not a perfect way to do this, but carrying this fight on any longer is not helping anybody.
Alex, something I noticed is something I thought very skillful of Sarah Sanders today, which is that she could have been dragged into a media fight about the former presidents who gave separate speeches yesterday, not coordinated, but that were largely seen to be critical of the president himself. And yet Sarah Sanders, I think, rightly and skillfully turned it back around and said they didn't take it personally.
No, that's absolutely right. It was really unusual for this White House to not take a fight when they're punched. And it reminded me of what President Trump did earlier this week when John McCain also gave a speech very similar to the speech that President Bush did yesterday.
Yeah, kind of took a pass.
And President Trump said, look, I'm not going to fight him on this. I don't want that fight. It's smart. It's really smart. They should be talking about tax reform. They should be trying to bring Republicans together to get something done here. And the last thing they want right now is a big fight with President Bush or John McCain or even former President Obama.
Because they don't need it, Michael, because I only have 30 seconds, but do you think that the Democrats are now surprised that the Republicans seem to have this really clear runway to get tax reform done?
Yeah, no, it's a shocker. I mean, it's been 30 years since you've gotten this close to having any tax reform. The Republicans have put aside the deficit reduction nature of it all, except Senator Paul's the only one to raise that, and should be having victory laps between both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, and instead you have this. So, I mean,
are the Democrats worried?
Well, there's a lot of time bombs inside that budget, and budgets are basically a declaration of your priorities, so there'll be a lot for us to chew on.
We've got a long way to go, but we feel good about it.
Okay, well, thank you for being here and for staying for the briefing. Michael Meehan and Alex Conant, appreciate it. In the battle over health care, lawmakers are focusing on two competing bills. Let's take a look. The Alexander Murray bill keeps protections for pre-existing conditions while giving states flexibility to waive some coverage requirements. It lets insurers develop health plans and allows people to buy catastrophic plans with basic coverage. Now, the Graham-Cassidy bill leaves many Obamacare taxes in place and lets state waive some regulations related to pre-existing conditions. It also repeals the Medicaid expansion as well as federal premium and cost-sharing subsidies. It keeps dependent coverage for kids up to the age of 26. Andy Slavitt is former acting administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and Robert Moffett, I should say. I know him by Bob, as a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation Center for Health Policy Studies. Andy, you did a lot of tweeting yesterday, and I thought it was very interesting. You seem to like the Alexander Murray bill. Is that right?
Well, what I like is anything that has both parties putting their fingerprints on something and recognizing that Republicans would prefer to see this as a short-term path to repeal. Democrats would like to see this as ways to make the ACA work better. What the American public wants to see is the benefit of something like this that has an immediate impact on their premiums, reduces their premiums, and reduces the federal deficit. And I think, importantly, it could be a first step in a long, long slog of back and forth over the last 7, if not 10 years of parties essentially saying this is going to be winner take all. So I'm hopeful.
So, Bob, earlier in the week, President Trump initially signaled that he would be supportive of the bipartisan effort, and then he pulled it back sort of later in the day. And there are conservatives who are concerned about it. Even though it's a short-term fix, is this something that you would not be able to support?
I don't think that we would support something like this right now. The bill is basically a baby step in terms of regulatory reform. If you look at what's wrong with the individual market and the small group market, the health care costs are horrendous, especially for people in the middle class who do not get any kind of subsidies at all. The Alexander Murray bill does not go far enough in terms of regulatory reform. And frankly, the cost-sharing subsidies are kind of beside the point in a way. A lot of the low-income folks who would benefit from this will benefit anyway as a result of federal subsidies. But my view is that, no, it does not go far enough. What Congress has to do is it has to attack the fundamental underlying problem that we have, which is health care costs. And health care costs are being driven up by this excessive regulatory regime in Washington.
Well, and earlier this week, Andy, President Trump said that he believes that they actually now do have the votes. It wasn't clear exactly what bill he was talking about, but it's possibly Graham Cassidy, and yet the Republican Congress was unable to pass that. So what happens in your experience if nothing happens between now and then? What will happen to people's premiums and the whole system?
Well, if Alexander and Murray's bill passes, I think we'll see a 20% reduction in premiums for the middle class. And I think we should keep it as simple as that. I know that think tanks both on the left and the right have an idealized view of what the world looks like. But when we govern well, we govern with compromise. If we don't do that, I think we will end up where we're essentially saying we don't like the ACA, so let's just keep shooting at it and shooting at it so it gets worse and worse and worse for people. I don't think that's how people expect them to govern. And I think we can take up in the new year long-term reforms of whatever type. There's no question that there's elements of every law that need to be working better. But right now, we have a chance to depoliticize things for a moment, get everybody on board with something that's actually good for people, and it's very hard to argue. Doctors, hospitals, patient groups, the Chamber of Commerce, everybody has said, let's go with Alexander Murray's bill.
Bob, when the Republicans failed to pass that legislation at the very real frustration of President Trump after, of course, being told that it was going to happen. Right. So now you actually have Obamacare more popular than it was even a year ago. So what kind of messaging do you think conservatives need to put forward to tell people actually it would be okay if we dismantle it and if we try to do something from whole cloth?
No, I think the fact is what conservatives ought to do is be very straight with the American people. We are not going to get health care costs under control if we retain the same system that we have today. And a minor regulatory change like Alexander Murray is proposing is far inferior to what we need to do. If you're a person who is in the health insurance exchanges or you're in the individual market, this year you've seen 25% increases nationwide in your health insurance premiums, looking at maybe 18% next year. And you've seen deductibles simply skyrocket. They're explosive, horrendous health care costs. Yeah. And it's hurting individuals and also people in small businesses who are being hit with these horrendous costs. The problem is many of the regulatory, much of the regulation is actually driving these costs. The age rating alone drives up health care costs for young people by about 33%. So no, they've got to stick to it. They've got to get the job done. And if they can't get it done now, they've got to come back in January, and they've really got to be serious about it and make that case.
Well, we'll see if the bipartisan effort moves forward or if the conservatives decide to figure out a way to do this as they have done on tax reform. You're both amazing. Thank you so much, Andy Slavitt and Bob Moffett. Appreciate it so much. Fox News Alert, Senator John McCain set to meet with Defense Secretary James Mattis this afternoon. McCain is threatening a subpoena to get information on the ambush that left 4 U.S. soldiers dead in Niger. Peter Ducey is live on Capitol Hill. Peter, what do you know?
Dana, Senator McCain has been complaining that Congress is not being treated as a co-equal branch of government by an administration that still has not briefed the Senate Armed Services Committee about that ambush more than 2 weeks ago in Niger that killed 4 American soldiers. And this meeting today, very rare, with the Defense Secretary in McCain's personal office, comes just a day after McCain threatened to force Secretary Mattis to come here.
What steps will you take, Senator, to get to the bottom of this? What steps will you take for the community to get to the bottom of this?
Require a subpoena.
It is very rare for a defense secretary to do damage control on Capitol Hill in a one-on-one meeting with a lawmaker, but McCain takes his position of oversight of the Pentagon very seriously, and he is accusing the administration of withholding, he says, everything about this attack, and he took his frustrations to the floor of the Senate, so they are now part of the official record.
4 just died in Niger. How many members of this body, how many of the 100 members of this body knew we even had an operation in Niger? Well, I won't go into the details in deference to the family.
So it's been more than 2 weeks since this October 4th ambush, and still no official account. The Pentagon has been saying they don't want to say anything until they know everything, but we don't know when that's going to be.
And I thought that Secretary Mattis yesterday, when he spoke to reporters and when he was at the Pentagon, and he said, please don't confuse our ability to get you as much information as you want with the time that you want it. So I feel like he's being pretty disciplined, and the executive branch never wants to have to go up and talk to the legislative branch, but perhaps are they hoping that they can get the Congress to understand that they've got an investigation going on and to back off on the public comments a little bit?
Well, even though this meeting may be uncomfortable for Secretary Mattis because McCain has been complaining about the lack of information from who he says is a friend of more than 20 years, it would probably be even less pleasant for the Pentagon if they had to come here in an open hearing room because McCain sent a subpoena over to Arlington across the Potomac River. So he's here on his own, trying to clear the air for McCain, but every chance that McCain has had in the hallways the last couple days, he's been saying, the Pentagon has not told him anything, and he thinks that that is a big problem. And we hear a commotion down this way, so we do expect to see Secretary Mattis at some point soon. Dana.
All right. Well, you've been on the Capitol all week following John McCain, so I'm sure he'll be happy to see you again if you have a chance.
Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. All right. Why airline passengers could be banned from packing laptops and other devices in checked bags. Leland Vittert will join me with to explain. All right, Secretary James Mattis is on Capitol Hill. He has arrived, and he will be having that meeting with Senator John McCain about the attack in Niger, where 4 U.S. soldiers died. And this is hopefully preventing McCain from sending that subpoena that he has been threatening all week. And then you see our own Peter Doocy, who is there in the hallways, making sure that he can keep tabs on this for us. And I'm sure Fox News, we will bring all of it to you as soon as it continues. Now, I told you that Leland Vittert's going to be here because he has news that airline passengers could soon be banned from checking laptops in their luggage. It's a new proposal that would ban laptops and other electronics from luggage on flights. The FAA warns large devices could overheat and catch fire, especially when packed near an aerosol can. So he's joining me now. This is Leland Vittert. He has props with him. I didn't know what that meant in the tease earlier. I was like, props? What do you mean,
Only
props?
for you, Dana. Only for you.
And you brought your hairspray.
Or yours, perhaps.
I think
Something
it's
you
yours.
carry. Yeah, well,
pretty much everyone knows it's yours.
Busted. Okay, I got it. All right. So, hairspray you travel with, you obviously can't carry this on because of the new rules. Obviously, your laptop you can carry on, iPad, those kinds of things. But inside these two normally perfectly safe items that you are allowed to check and often are checked, well, inside every laptop is a quite powerful lithium battery. And the batteries can get so hot that they start a fire. Put it next to something like a hairspray that is under pressure. Add a little bit of extra heat like the FAA did in their test. And we have some video of that. And quite literally, boom, a fire at over 1,100 degrees, an explosion inside a plane's cargo compartment. And it can overwhelm the plane's fire extinguishers, burn through the fuselage of the plane. Obviously, that has a terrible ending, as it has for a few cargo planes, not yet an airliner, but it has come close a couple of times with fires on airliners, and that's what they're worried about.
So this is about checked luggage, but what about in your carry-on?
Well, that's the big point. If a laptop is in your carry-on and it catches fire in the cabin of a plane, as it's happened, there are people there to put it out. Some planes even carry fireproof bags to put that flaming laptop in. Remember the Galaxy 7 phones that were banned? Well, not so much in a cargo hold. It's impossible to get down to get the checked baggage in flight, especially big concern on long flights over the ocean where there isn't a place to make an emergency landing. Right now, this is a recommendation by the FAA to a world body that regulates such matters. And it brings up this whole debate once again. What can we bring on planes? Sometimes now the TSA is even saying they are going to check hardcover books. So, Dana.
Hardcover books?
Yeah, they check those too. So perhaps, Dana, the only thing that you can have left is sitting next to the guy
that you
in the
meet
seat
on a
next to
plane.
you. There you
never know
go.
what'll happen. All right, Leland Vittert, thank you so much. We'll be right back. So guess what? I'm going to be hosting Fox News Sunday, which is why I'm in Washington. I'll be doing a special feature with White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders, who you just saw briefing the press. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell will also join me. We have a lot to talk to him about in a week, where he met with President Trump and the Senate passed a budget. And California Attorney General Xavier Becerra in an exclusive interview. I hope you tune in. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dana. Here's Shep.